Welcome to Across the Hall, a podcast sharing ELA strategies from one door away, with your hosts, Kate Summers and Michelle Shelton. This is episode 4, Maker Mindset.
I've been an English teacher for 20 years at the same high school here in western rural Maine. I've taught at Mount Blue High School that whole time, taught 9th through 12th. I've taught everything from the most struggling freshmen through the AP Lit seniors. And at various times in my career, everything in between. I've co-founded a humanities program. We piloted a student-led class called PACE, which was intended to allow students to set their own learning goals and own pathways through the sophomore year curriculum, through the 4 core classes. I've been a part of a variety of other initiatives and movements on campus, customized learning, the movement towards proficiency-based, standards-based grading, all sorts of that kind of progressive education stuff has been pretty much characteristic for me through my whole teaching career. What's happened for the last 5 years especially was I made a transition from a project-based learning classroom to what I call a design thinking lab classroom. And the key difference there is a few years ago, a buddy of mine at school, we put a ton of energy into project-based learning, and we loved it. We loved the frameworks, essential questions, driving inquiry, students focusing not on tests, but on making a product, these sorts of things. But what we were finding is that, especially what I was finding, was at the end of the day, I still kept getting dumpster projects. They were meeting the standards. They were fulfilling the criteria on a rubric, but those rubrics were saying things like uses exceptional color. Is big, looks well made, things like that. And there wasn't as emphasis on the content. Like, it was very numerical so that we could easily count, like uses 7 examples, uses 4 examples, but nothing about the quality of the example, right? It might say effective, but there was something missing because kids were making stuff and I was looking at it and I was still throwing it away. There wasn't a desire to keep most of it. And the stuff that we did want to keep was really aesthetic. It was really because it was pretty. Right. It wasn't necessarily any better explaining the concept than the ugly thing. It just looked like they spent more time on it. And there was this massive disconnect between the learning that we wanted them to be able to demonstrate, the content, and then what we were having them do. So like project-based, which was supposed to be not a panacea, but was supposed to elevate. Well, yeah, it elevated us away from tests, but just like a kid throws a test away, they were throwing the projects away because there's no reason to keep them unless they were pretty, right? And the learning went right in the trash can with it. And I was super guilty of doing this. And then one night on Twitter, I discovered design thinking. At the DTK12 chat family, their hashtag DTK12 chat for all the listeners. And I became an instant convert, and because it shifts from being about the project to being about solving problems. And it shifts from being about turning something in on time to meeting the needs of others. And it's about empathy. And that's the key to design thinking. It's empathy-fueled, human-centered problem solving. So suddenly, which is a cliche to say, but suddenly my brain just did this inside out to, we could be making things that matter to demonstrate that I understand this novel. We could be making things that matter to demonstrate our understanding of poetry. We could be making things that matter to understand these dramatic concepts, or understand this historical notion that we need in the humanities class, or to whatever the content is, whatever that standard is, we could be designing designing solutions to problems that are related directly to the content. And once I got my head wrapped around that, everything else kind of took off. And that's where making and the idea of turning my classroom into a design lab and a maker space, to borrow, to use that terminology, really blossomed. And that's what I've been doing for the past 5 years.
Right. That's awesome. So whenever you did finally have that epiphany, where did you start?
So my very first design challenge was I had my students redesign my classroom.
Oh.
So I didn't start with content. I started with, because I was new to design thinking, and at that time I was still under the impression that I now realize for myself is a false impression, that design thinking is a process. That design thinking is a step-by-step, you go this, and this. Because I was still equating design thinking with project-based learning. And so much about PBL is you get this framework for the steps in the process, right? And you go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, or whichever brand you're using, 1, 2, 3, 4, or 1, 2, 3, 8, 9, 17, whatever it is.
Right.
And because there were brands of design thinking, I thought it was the same thing.
That as well, because a lot of times whenever you look up design thinking and you're trying to study about it, it'll have it in a graph that makes it look like it's supposed to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Exactly, right? And you see that everywhere. And that's part of the narrative of design thinking that I am part of trying to shift and change, especially when talking to educators, because I see design thinking is truly about thinking, and it's about a posture for thinking. It's a set of postures you take to develop this mindset into problem solving that starts with empathy and never really ends, because it starts with empathy and it's cyclical and it's recursive, and you have to keep going through these postures and these thinkings. But yeah, I'm not a linear thinker, so I'm really great on podcasts.
Yeah.
Right? Oh man, I have a voice, I have a face for audio, but I have the hand of the video. So that's the hard part about explaining it. But at that time, to go back to that original question, was what did we do first? Well, we did the classroom design because I wanted to use the steps. I wanted to follow the steps and to get myself familiar with design thinking. So I use Mary Cantwell's deep design thinking process, and you can find out about that particular process on deepdesignthinking.com, and you can follow her at SciTechieEDU on the Twitterverse. She's fantastic. I don't think I mentioned I'm at Wicked Decent on the Twitters as well. But I wanted to follow hers because it was only 4 steps, and she designed it for use with 2nd and 3rd graders. And I'm like, well, if 2nd and 3rd graders can handle learning this process, then my AP Lit students might do okay with it.
Yeah.
And I don't even mean that facetiously. they're like, hey, I want to do it my own way. I'm like, wait, we've got 4, it's just 4 steps, guys. Stay with me for 4 steps.
4 steps. You can do this.
But then we could do it, we could do it with any of my students. And that's what we did. We redesigned the classroom. We started with discovery. So that's step 1 in deep design, is you learn everything you can about the space. So when they came into my classroom, I had all of my stuff up against the wall. I just had a pile of chairs for them to sit in and explain that we were going to redesign this classroom to meet their needs. So all my furniture was just in this heap. And explore, what do you know about the space? So what do you know about the class so far? What do you know about English? We use some tools to get us through this. Then we had to do empathy work. So they had to figure out what each other wants in a classroom, in a learning environment. They had to find out what my needs are. They had to find out if there were any rules or requirements that the school needs, so that we're meeting all of the needs of the collective users. We developed a composite user profile, meaning like if you just had this like kind of average user of the room, what would they be like? And then we experimented with doodles and drawings and using Lego and a whole bunch of different manipulatives and junk that was laying around to build models. Then we went through a process of kind of taking the best ideas from different classes, because all my classes worked on it together. That was probably the hardest part, was finding a way so that everyone felt like they're getting ownership.
Right. Can't exactly change the room every class.
Okay.
All right, I'm going to, if you don't mind, I'm going to ask you a question here. So you're referring to the Legos and whatever you said, manipulatives. You're building a model of what your classroom would look like. Is that correct?
Yeah. Yep. Okay. That's exactly it. Yeah. We told it, like, they built up all sorts of 3-dimensional models, right? Because if they just draw it, well, one, every kid who's like, I can't draw, is already feeling like they're not, like, what's the point? Which is silly. It's a doodle. Like, it's like, it's okay, guys. It's like, I'm not assessing the doodle. The first question is always, is this count? It's like, well, it's your classroom, so yes, it counts. Like, it matters.
Rethink all the stress that I put myself through getting my classroom together. I could have just let the kids do it.
Right. That's essential. So that's essentially what ended up happening. They built them up, but then you could actually look and see, like, from different angles, and kids could see, like, wow, all of your stuff is like piled up in this corner, right? Like, what's that going to be like when we actually do it with the real stuff? The kids made interesting discoveries through the course of using the physical things, because one, they were getting better spatial reasoning figured out, but they were also able to have a conversation around something they could touch and hold. And there's something very powerful about that makes it a much more intimate experience. And I don't mean that in a creepy way. I mean that in a human to human way. When you're working around a model and you're using a model. So I think it's why architects build them. Like, you can base everything just on pictures, right? But when you have that, you have a conversation piece, right? It's the center of the table. It's there for you to refer to and to interact with. But just through that process allowed them to have a richer conversation. But for me as a teacher, I immediately saw my kids who I did not know. Remember, this is like day one. Like, this was like day one of school. We're doing this stuff. Like, the first 2 weeks of school, we're just designing the classroom. I was able to see who can think outside the box, who's a divergent thinker, who's a convergent thinker, who can work well with others, who is an introvert, who's an extrovert. I mean, I didn't use this as my only metric, to define the rest of the year, but I immediately got a sense. I got a sense of who the leaders were, who the positive disruptors were, who the negative disruptors were, who was going to be game on, who's game off, who are arts and craftsy folk, who are the opposite, I got a real strong sense of the personalities of my students, much, much richer than, fill out this survey, like the student interest survey, which I had done for years.
Yeah.
Years and years and years. And I don't do them anymore because I get so much more information by doing things.
So, thinking, there's so many different questions I have, but first of all, like, we're going to be teaching 5 classes this year with two different planning periods. So I've got 5 sets of students. Would you have those kids produce those models, keep the models on day 2, or after every period, break down the model, take pictures? What if, you know what I'm saying? Like, each set of kids might come up with different ideas. What do you do with that?
Yeah. So we kept everything because I only need to go. So we do a block schedule at Mount Blue. So Blue Day, Gold Day.
Uh-huh.
So I had classes and we'd cycle through, like I kept everything so that every cycle could see everything. But then at the end of the cycle, right, like if there's a build cycle, then every group needs to see everything that got built. And then we get back to the end of that second one, and then everything could be taken apart.
Okay.
And we documented everything. The glory of the cell phone cannot be denied. It is, right? And have the kids take pictures, have you take pictures. If, it depends on your school's like policies and such. I'm not saying to undermine, but I'm saying to undermine. Like BYOD, if you're using a device for a learning experience, I don't see the problem.
Be a game changer.
We have a very permissive set of policies that balance accountability and fear against opportunity and potential, right? So I'm really fortunate. Darcy Dunphy is our district administrator for technology, and she's fantastic. Shout out to Darcy, who's not on Twitter, but she's an amazing human. And she's a great admin for us. And we have other good admin too, who also, we don't get a lot of pushback on that. So my kids bust out their phones and take tons of pictures and upload them. I might give them a shared link. I've done this project now like for 5 years. So every year it goes through a new iteration of how we go about doing it. One year, I think, I'm trying to remember if this actually happened or if it was just a dream or more of a nightmare.
It happens to me a lot.
Where I didn't have them, like I kept the room set up the same and then said, let's do a new iteration. No, I think I did that. I think on year 3 I did that. And it was like, it flopped. It stunk. The kids left it the same. We lost out on all of the community building that we got out of those first 2 weeks. And so for the last 2 years, we've done it proper, like scratch, and I've given them we discovered some things in the process, like, wow, this piece of furniture really has to be here because of wires and cabling or something, or, the phone can't, there are creative constraints. And that's what we call them, creative constraints. You can be as creative as you want, and you still have to meet this criteria. So how are you going to do that in a way that still meets all of your other needs? Well, we say we can't move the projector that's hardwired into the wall.
So our podcast is all about how to use different things in the English classroom. I know you've been teaching for English for a really long time. So how are some ways that you've used makerspaces, design thinking to teach standards for ELA?
So I've got a bunch of examples that I like to go to as my go-tos. And the first one is with Of Mice and Men. I have my students do Of Mice and Tiny Houses as our unit. So what they design are scale models of tiny houses, following the principles of sustainable design, of the tiny house movement. They have to investigate and do an inquiry piece to understand what tiny houses are, what separates them from a typical house, what are the sizes and the space constraints that are associated with those, what are the principles that people live by when they live in a tiny house. And then they have to apply all that knowledge that they acquire to meeting the needs of Lenny and George and Crooks and Candy from Of Mice and Men. And I let them pick which of the characters they want to focus on, whose needs they want to meet. I think on the last iteration of the rubric, I said exceeding the standard was actually meeting 4 sets of needs, because that demonstrated to me a deeper understanding of the text.
Right.
Because if you can extrapolate what Candy needs and see that that's different from what Crook's needs, then you get the literal understanding of the text, but also Like, where are the nuances? Like, how do you understand that an African American from the 1930s is going to want like private space, as Crook says, but also time to commune with the others as clearly he wants, right? So, you know, I really want them to be able to design for all four, right? To really like take it to the next level. And can you figure out a way to do that? And they came up with amazing designs.
That sounds like an awesome idea. So what kind
They
of,
did all the
you're breaking up just a little bit.
We'll give it just, there we are.
Hold on
Can
just
you
a
hear
second.
us?
Yeah, we back?
Okay, we're back.
back.
Yeah.
And we're back.
Right.
Yeah.
So I was saying that sounds like a really awesome idea. So what kind of supplies did you need in your room in order for them to be able to do that?
So this was all done on a shoestring. We used leftover cardboard from our cardboard challenge. The kids were encouraged to find material from home and bring it in, but I do everything on my maker carts. My maker carts, by the way, are reclaimed AV carts from our building renovation when they got rid of a whole bunch of stuff and they got rid of a bunch of TVs and VCRs and stuff. And I just went to the surplus where these things were in storage and brought them back. So I've got like 4 or 5 just of varying sizes, these rolling carts in my room. And they're covered with stuff from our local recycling center. We have they call it Everyone's Resource Depot at the University of Maine at Farmington. And it's similar to, well, there's a place called Maine Share. You find them often at children's museums, you know, places where you can go and buy recycled stuff for like pennies and use it for arts and crafts, right? So you can get shoelaces and buttons and weird overruns from factories and stuff that send leftovers. We have a wood turning mill up the road, and so we get lots of little dowel bits and these strange things. So for like $20, I can like $20 a semester. I've got more stuff than we're going to use.
Oh wow!
And then I'm a pack rat. Like anything I find that I think, oh, that's a neat bit. That's a weird, neat thing to have. Let's just use it. Let's throw that on the cart. All my kids, like my own kids, Happy Meal toys end up on the maker cart. Busted toys end up on the maker cart. Old parts of games end up on the maker cart. So you don't have to spend a lot of money. You don't need any budget to start with. If you've got $50 that you're willing to spend out of pocket to get things that you might not otherwise be able to afford initially, you know, a couple of hot glue guns and, you know, maybe if you need them, some sort of a sorting device. But, you know, my stuff is in old Tupperware and recycled shoe boxes and oatmeal containers and whatever, you know, just, it doesn't matter, because what matters is, what is it that you want them to demonstrate? And are you giving them enough variety of material to be able to demonstrate their understanding in a way that is meaningful to them? You know, and so I asked the kids, what is it that you need? What do you want? So we did all those prototypes. Some of them came out looking gorgeous, but all I cared is that they were built to scale, because I want to have that math piece in there. And tiny houses are so important. Like, scale matters, right? Like, it's inherent. Otherwise, it's not a tiny house. So they had to build them to scale, but they picked the scale they wanted to build at. So they chose their scale, and kids came in with stuff made from foam board that they went and bought, and I chastised them. Said, "Why did you buy foam board? Like, it's a school project." I'm like, "That's crazy. You spent $12. Like, why? Like, there's all this leftover cardboard over here, you know." But that's okay. Like, it doesn't. In the end, you know, one kid she insisted on painting it. I said, "Why are you painting it?" And she said, "Because it should be painted." I go, "Well, what color?" And she went, I said, "This better be intentional. If you're going to take all that time to paint this thing, why are you going to paint it the color you're going to paint it?" "Well, this is the only colors I have." I'm like, "Then that's silly. That's not worth your time. You've got to choose a color that's going to add meaning to to the project. And that's something that I try to instill with my students all the time, is make a deliberate, intentional choice through all of this silly shenanigans. What happens when you take that and you like evolve it, you amplify it by adding that next layer of purpose and meaning.
Right. So what is another thing that you've done in your English?
So I love doing design labs around poetry.
Oh, cool.
So we'll ask like a question like, how might we demonstrate the power of this poem through Lego? How might we demonstrate the power of this poem through these 4 items on your desk? How might we, one of my labs is called Shape of a Sonnet. So they have to take a sonnet of their choice. Usually, like, we've been studying a couple, right? So it's nice to do like a little kind of more traditional analysis work for a couple of sonnets. And then I'll say, all right, read these 4 sonnets tonight, break them down yourself, use our analytical tools that you know how to do. We're going to be doing something with them next class. And they come in next class having done the thinking, hopefully. This is from an AP Lit crew, by the way. Like, I'm trying to do away with homework for my underclassmen. But for AP Lit, I think the idea of being prepared for college, since it's an AP Lit class, like, it kind of, you have to do the work at home because college is built that way. But for my other students, I'm trying really hard to do away with homework. But anyway, that's another conversation for another day. But anyway, so they come in with those poems, and then I take them through the design process. They've discovered about the poem. I use that deep design process again. So they've discovered the poem, they've understood about the poem. Then they do some empathy work, and the way they do empathy work is they interview each other, and they find out what the other people in the class saw in the poem. And so that they might uncover things that they missed, that when they're thinking about how they might articulate those ideas, that they capture it all. And then during the discovery work is also when I let them know what their materials are going to be. If I'm going to give them any sort of a constraint. So I might say everything on this cart, and that cart might include all of the maker materials, or it might just include buttons, shoelaces, and dominoes. Like, it might just be that. It might be a pile of markers and a bunch of old toilet paper tubes and dental floss and a package of Oreos. that might be what's there. Then they go through an experiment phase where they sketch and they doodle and they play around. And then I give them like, all right, now you got time to build your prototype. And what they have to demonstrate in the prototype is they have to show me the structure they have to build a structure that mirrors the structure of the sonnet. And they have to be able to emphasize the volta, the turn in the poem, because that's what, one of those key elements of the sonnet, right? It's where however that sonnet is rhetorically designed, that's where there's that shift. So they have to show me where that shift is through their model. They build, they create, they design the whole thing, and then at the end, they make a video where they do a walkthrough. Explaining it. And I should say, and I didn't mention this earlier when talking about mice and tiny houses, for all of these things, I have them, any of our making labs, they have to complete an intention map at the end. And the intention map is where they use photo documentation by taking pics. We're a one-to-one Mac Air school, so we have technology available readily to every kid. And they take pictures, document their learning. They don't have to take a picture. They could just handwrite in or describe the design element, what that shows, text evidence that links between the design element and the text that they're working with, and an explanation of how how that design element demonstrates your understanding of that text. And the last part of the map is where I asked them to explain what they would do in a future iteration, right? Like if you had longer, if you could go back to it again. So that way I am not doing the thinking for them. And I'm not doing that whole like, this is so cool. And then realizing the emperor has no clothes. They just made something pretty.
So thank you for listening, and we will see you next time.
Bye.
Don't forget to stop by acrossthehallpodcast.com for the show notes and join the Across the Hall conversation on Twitter at #XTheHall. We hope you join us next time as we talk about tools teachers can use for digital annotation.